Good evening, folks. If you're just joining us, welcome to the Upper Clark Fork Superfund update. Folks are being automatically added to the webinar right now, and so we'll just wait a little bit until folks get in. Thanks for your patience and thanks for joining us tonight. Pretty excited. Still have a few people joining, so we'll just give it a minute or two to make sure we maximize participation, and we will move forward. Okay, folks, looks like we've hit critical mass with our numbers of participants. Welcome very much on behalf of the University of Montana and the public agencies who I'll introduce to you in a moment, and the Clark Fork Coalition. Thank you so much, and welcome to this discussion called Upper Clark Fork Superfund Update, a facilitated discussion with public agency representatives and an update on the Superfund process in the Upper Clark Fork. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Brian Chaffin. I'm an assistant professor of water policy in the College of Forestry and Conservation here at the University of Montana. I'm happy to serve tonight as your moderator for this evening and in this discussion with public agency representatives from the Department of Environmental Quality, the Natural Resources Damage Program, and the Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, or Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks here as our state representatives. Before we begin, I'd like to formally acknowledge that the University of Montana, as well as the Upper Clark Fork River Basin that we'll be speaking about tonight, is located in the Aboriginal territories of the Salish and Kalispel people, many of whom are present with us tonight and for this discussion. Today, we respect and honor the path they've always shown us in caring for this place for generations to come. We recognize specifically that the Upper Clark Fork that we will talk about is their traditional home and a travel and trade corridor for many of Montana's indigenous peoples. So why are we doing this tonight? What are we up to? First and foremost, this is a follow-up from a series of public meetings in the Upper Clark Fork River Valley over the last couple of years about Superfund cleanup and the restoration of the river. We've held two formal public meetings, one in Deer Lodge and one in Anaconda, where we heard from both public agency representatives, but also representatives of non-governmental organizations, environmental groups, conservation groups, and citizens groups. Also, we have some specific goals this evening. One, to meet representatives from your public agencies tasked with different aspects of Superfund remediation, restoration, and monitoring. Two, to get an update about the work that has been done in the Upper Clark Fork and plans for the next phases of work projects. And three, to prepare yourselves, hopefully, to engage in a process to provide public comment and feedback to agencies working on Superfund. So who's here? Tonight, I'm pleased to introduce three speakers from state agencies that will talk to us a little bit about the Superfund progress and processes in the Upper Clark Fork. Joel Chavez from the Montana Department of Environmental Quality, Bo Downing from the Montana Natural Resources Damage Program, and Nathan Cook from Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. Also on our panel is Alex Leone from the Clark Fork Coalition. Clark Fork Coalition is one of our big sponsors. And myself, Brian Chaffin from the University of Montana. Joel, Bo, and Nathan will have their email addresses and their contact information on their respective slides. So I just went ahead and put Alex's and mine there if you would like to get a hold of us afterwards. So let me go over quickly the format for this evening and some ground rules. First, for your speakers and myself as the moderator, each speaker will get about 15 minutes, and I like to stay true to that, so I'm going to hold them to that, to give us a brief presentation and overview of what they do. After each speaker, I will ask them to address just brief questions to clarify aspects of their presentation. So these are clarity questions. If they said something that you might not have understood, but it's not a larger discussion that I'd like to hold for later, we'll answer those questions at that time. Also, I'd like to note that at the bottom of your Zoom screen, if you click, if you hover over the Zoom screen, you'll see a series of icons, and one of those icons says Q&A. If you click on Q&A and pull that up, this is a place for you to type in questions that then we can address our speakers both after their specific presentations and then later in a question and answer period. So please use that, and I'll use that to address specific questions to our speakers tonight. As I mentioned, all other questions will be held at the end of all 3 presentations to be addressed by everyone in a Q&A session. For the audience, ask questions. We'd love to know what some of your comments, thoughts, and questions are for the speakers, and use that Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen to do so. So the first thing we want to know here is a little bit, I've told you a little bit about our speakers, but now I want to know a little bit about you. And so one of the, if I can figure this out, and I apologize, I've lost my my icon to find the polling, but I want to ask you a quick question. There it is. I'm going to launch this poll right now. So if you're watching this webinar, you should have a poll that pops up on your screen that asks you to answer a question. The question is basically, who are you? We want to know where you're from. Please choose the category that best represents your interest. And I see that folks are finding that, and answers are coming in right now. So are you an Upper Clark Fork landowner? Are you part of just the general interested public? Are you public agency representative, NGO, fishing professional, student or faculty, industry representative, tribal representative? I'll give you about a minute to go ahead and answer that question, and maybe 30 seconds. It looks like most people have answered. And then I'll close the poll and show everyone the results. Okay, looks like most people have answered. So I'm going to go ahead and end polling and share the results with you. One of the automatic features of a Zoom webinar is it always shows you which answer choice of a question won or was the most popular. So you'll notice that student or faculty is highlighted as the winner of this category. But it's great to see that we have representatives from across the spectrum: landowners, interested public, public agencies, fishing professionals, NGOs, industry, and tribes. Thanks so much for being here, as well as obviously students and faculty. So I'm going to go ahead and stop share that now. So let's just talk quickly and briefly about Upper Clark Fork, the Upper Clark Fork Superfund, and how did we get here? And just for a quick 10,000-foot view overview and history of the contamination, Butte and the entire Upper Clark Fork region was a mining metropolis beginning in the 1860s. Massive amounts of ore were extracted from underground workings, and after all this processing, ore and tailings piled up across the Butte area and at the headwaters of the Upper Clark Fork River. A brief mining history of Butte. Butte began as a gold boomtown in 1864. It was first mined for silver in the late copper in the late 1870s. Mines located on the hill north and east of Silverbow Creek, the headwaters of the Upper Clark Fork, owned and operated by several large mining companies. Ore had to be processed via concentrators and smelters, which were located in Butte before eventually moving to Anaconda. This, as I mentioned earlier, created a lot of mine waste, rock tailings, slag, all very much contaminated. And smoke too. We can't forget that there was pollution in the air, which eventually was deposited across the region. This waste had to go somewhere. Silverbow Creek was used as a conduit for mining, smelting, and industrial and municipal activities for more than 100 years. It was essentially an open industrial sewer. Each concentrator and each smelter discharged hundreds of tons of tailings into the floodplain of Silverbow Creek every day. Tailings contained lead, arsenic, cadmium, copper, zinc, and this fundamentally changed Silverbow Creek as well as the upper reaches of the Clark Fork. And specifically, the section flowing through town became known as the Metro Storm Drain. It was rerouted as necessary to accommodate this waste disposal. So that's kind of the background of the contamination in the area. But it wasn't until 1908 that those tailings and that contamination really moved significantly into the Upper Clark Fork River Valley and the Upper Clark Fork Basin. This flood of 1908 is still considered to be the largest flood in record, or specifically in Euro-American post-colony or post-colonist history. Deer Lodge Valley ranchers recalled that the river was a quarter-mile wide in places. Not only did massive amounts of water flow downstream, but with it, tons and tons of mine tailings laden with toxic sediments such as copper, arsenic, cadmium, lead, and zinc. So why are we cleaning up the Clark Fork River today? Over 100 years later, after the flood of 1908, those toxic sediments continue to impact aquatic life in the Upper Clark Fork. This picture in particular was taken last spring in 2020 on the Upper Clark Fork floodplain. The river is about 100 yards to the right, and this blue color represents copper in the water that's still stored in that floodplain. These photos are just for some context. Contaminated settlements within the Upper Clark Fork floodplain continue to leach into the river. Areas that have been cleaned up no longer contribute contamination. The aerial photo on the left shows a high water side channel flowing through contaminated slicken, which are these kind of above the river plains that contain some of these toxic sediments from the flood. The photo on the upper right is what a slicken looks like after it dries out midsummer. And the photo on the bottom shows the confluence, what the confluence of Silverbow Creek and Browns Gulch used to look like pre-remediation and restoration. Silverbow Creek has been a huge success in the story in terms of water quality improvements, which we won't dwell on here today, but there's a lot of great information out there about Silverbow Creek, and including, and I'll push, if you haven't heard the podcast by Montana Public Radio and hosted by Nora Sachs, who is a journalism student from the University of Montana. Go Grizz. If you haven't heard The Richest Hill, I would direct you that way to learn much more about some of the history of mining in Butte, as well as the specifics of Silverbow Creek. So one of the primary drivers of the cleanup is to remove contamination, which would be detrimental, obviously, to human health. It's important to remember that risks to human health are the primary driver of Superfund, and many folks recreate on the river, and the river runs through multiple communities from Galen to Superior. It's important to remember that contamination was not only deposited in the river and on the floodplains, but also through smelting and aerial deposition, as I mentioned earlier. Contamination covers a huge area, over 100 miles of the Main Stem River floodplain and over 300 square miles of aerial deposition. As we move on in time, the 1970s and 1980s really mark a turning point for contamination in the Upper Clark Fork and in other parts of the country. Big improvements to water quality and the environment was spurred by a series of changes to federal and state policy. The recognition of the need and the right to a clean and healthful environment in the Montana Constitution, as well as changes to water quality that were spurred at the federal level, that also spurred action at the state level from the Water Quality Act and CERCLA, which is the Superfund law. I noticed in the chat there, if folks want to check up the chat, DQ has put together a story map that covers the history and cleanup of Silverbow Creek, and there's a link to that in the chat there. So that's a great reference. Thanks, Kevin, for that as well. So who pays for the cleanup? Big question. When we present this information, there's always that question of who pays for that. Well, it's not taxpayer money. Montana sued ARCO, formerly the Anaconda Copper Company, for damages to the natural resources of the state. And that first lawsuit was filed in 1983 under the Superfund law, CERCLA. And from 1999 to 2008, there were a series of settlements. And I may mention just quickly that this is a very brief and abbreviated history of a long, long saga of contamination in the Upper Clark Fork, as well as the Superfund process of settling those and finding out who pays and what work there is to do. I'm just giving you kind of a 10,000-foot overview to frame where we are today and what our panelists will talk about. But over this time period, there was a series of settlements. And from those settlements, there was at least $500 million in damages that were recovered by the state of Montana, specifically for the Upper Clark Fork cleanup. There's three major areas of the Upper Clark Fork that are set or have been worked on and will be worked on, and those are Reach A, Reach B, and Reach C. Reach A is from the confluence of Warm Springs to Garrison. Reach B from Garrison to Drummond, and Reach C from Drummond to the former Milltown Reservoir. And we know that the former Milltown Reservoir has already been cleaned, and much of the work that we're going to hear about from DEQ, NRDP, and FWP today is going to be in Reach A and a little bit in Reach B. The focus of the remaining cleanup will be in Reach A. So in this whole process, and I just mentioned a couple acronyms, and if we get confused with acronyms, please put that in the chat, and we'll try to sort that out. But there's always a lot of those flying around when we bring in our state and federal agencies. But today we're going to focus on a few. There's a lot of different groups across the federal and the state nexus that are involved in Superfund cleanup, and it can feel very overwhelming. Specifically, there's a mix of state and federal agencies and also watershed groups that are working towards remediation and restoration of this landscape. NRDP and DEQ are the primary agencies tasked with the on-the-ground cleanup work, but there are a slew of other state and federal agencies tasked with helping to monitor the cleanup, its effectiveness, including who we'll hear from today is FWP. So Department of Environmental Quality, Natural Resource Damage Program, and Fish, Wildlife, and Parks is who we will hear from today. And so without further ado, I'd love to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Joel Chavez. He's a project officer with Montana Department of Environmental Quality, and he's going to talk a little bit about DEQ, his work, and what they do towards Superfund cleanup in the Upper Clark Fork. Joel, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Brian, and thanks for the great background. That saves a lot here. So go ahead and go to the first slide, please. DEQ, that's where I work, and you can see our mission statement here. But for the purposes of the Clark Fork River, DEQ's the lead agency to implement the remedy, which is really mostly the physical cleanup of the banks and the floodplain, and it has to do mostly with removal of contaminants and rebuilding the banks. We do the remediation, there is the restoration. I think the best way to think about it is the goal of the remediation is to get the river back to a point where it can eventually achieve baseline, and restoration is to get it to baseline quicker. That's a quick analogy, but I think that really covers it, because most of the time it seems like kind of a fog bank between remediation and restoration. Is really a continuum. Go ahead, Brian. So this map, and we'll come back to this, it's very busy, and in this format it's hard to read things, but this is really a picture of most of Reach A from Orange Springs to Deer Lodge, and it's trying to illustrate some of the things that all of our work has been in Reach A, starting about 2011 and carrying on right now and well past right now. There has been a lot of work done there. We have currently done some of the phases. The phases are about, I'd say between 1.5 miles and 2 miles, about 1.5 miles of river, more or less. But this is Reach A. This is where we have done and will be doing most of the work. It goes a little further than this down to Garrison, but that's really where the action is. Some things here we'll get back to, but right now I think to start phase 15 and 16 in the upper part, it's got an orange circle around it. That's what we've just finished, and in the lower part of the map with the other orange circle is phase 3, which is where we're going. So today, like I said, we want to talk about, a little bit I want to talk about was what we've just completed on phase 15 and 16, our plans for phase 3, what the status of that is, and I think importantly, some of the things we're doing a little different, and I'll touch on some of the things we'll likely be doing with the Natural Resource Damage Program, though I think Bo's going to fill in a little bit of the detail on that. And the other thing I want to touch on at the end of this is, just kind of the status of where we're going next after phase 3 and where that process is. So this is just a schematic map. Deer Lodge, showing the Grand Cours National Historic Site. I'm just pretty much in town and just out of town. We started that a couple years ago, 2018, late, got it done just this last January. It took a while. We had some weather that kind of slowed us down, not enough, wouldn't, stop traffic on the interstate, but between some 3 high water events this last a year ago, usually a figure on 2, we got 3, things like that. But we are pretty much done except for, I think we have 17,000 plants to put in this fall, and we have a little bit of actual seeding, and that is being done. Well, it started yesterday, and we'll be done with that next week. A couple of things we did, we removed a lot of contaminants there. I think 326,000, what the slide says, and that is accurate. And a good way to picture that is, typically in, any town, the cities or towns going to have some dump trucks. They're about 10 yards. So that would be 32,600 of those trucks. It's really a lot of material. 2.5 river miles for 2 phases. Like I said earlier, each phase, 1.25 miles, 1.5 miles. In this case, 1.25 miles. And pretty much the associated floodplain. The work, it's expensive work, but this particular contract, we were able to find some ways to economize as we did this, and I'm happy to say this actually came in probably $1.5 million lower than we anticipated. So that's always good news, and we need to keep doing that. So the next slide, please, Brian. So here's a pretty typical excavation shot. This is, of course, Grand Cours Ranch, phase 15 and 16 once again, but it could be virtually any place in Reach A on the river. The groundwater is real close to the surface, and you're really close to the river. So that's always dealing with water, pumping water, and you got to get the water drained out low enough so you can actually excavate to a known depth and not just have a big mud puddle. So that's what this slide really shows. It just kind of shows the pretty typical conditions that you can pretty much expect year round in this kind of work. Here's another shot at Grand Cours Ranch, and you can see across the river on the left, right below that Jack Lake fence. It's kind of hard to make out, but there's a lot of woody debris that we actually put in the banks there all along the bank of the river, and that is to kind of protect those banks when they get going and give them a head start. In all this work, we all want the most softest, for lack of a better term, bank you can build so they deform naturally, and that's what we've been doing and will continue to do. However, when you do that, you stand a big risk when you just get done. It's very vulnerable, and you get this stuff in there, and hopefully it'll hold things together. The other thing about this slide, these cottonwood trees in the back, we left those there. Around the base of those trees, there are contaminants, and those contaminants were left in place. So some of this is a bit of a trade-off. Those trees are probably pushing close to 100 years old, and we just thought it was the best thing to do is to leave that. So when we say we remove all the contaminants, we do, but sometimes the trade-off to leave some existing good vegetation is what we do. So here's a shot that shows a couple things going on here. You can see the river in the background. So once again, we're right up next to the river, and that's problematic with some spring floods. When you've got this kind of excavation and you're lowering the floodplain, you're pretty susceptible to any high water events. We had, like I said, 3 last year. they cause some damage, nothing really significant, but they do shut you down because you are pretty much at the river level. This shot, there's some contaminants being excavated, and right in the forefront is some clean fill that's been placed there. One thing about when we do removals on the floodplain in Reach A, for the most part, is artificially high because of the volume of contaminants that are there. So what has been done and what we are doing is we're doing the removal, and then we're trying to leave the floodplain lower than it currently exists before we get there, to promote it's more natural, it's closer to the groundwater. And we do it right, it gets some of these overbank events and helps to get vegetation going. This shot here shows a couple of different things. This is a shot of some, this vegetation in the forefront is probably about, I don't know, 3 months old, 4 months old. You know, it's in its first year growth. Looks spotty, but believe me, that's actually very good vegetation. And in a few years, that'll be, I would imagine, fully covered. So this is like what we like to see in the first year of growth. In this picture, you also can see some fences. Orange arrow points out some in the background. There's some more just on the left side of the photo. And these fences, enclosures, were put up to protect all the woody transplants we put in there. When you first plant these woody species, they're pretty delicate and they're pretty attractive to the wildlife to eat. So we have to build these things around them. We changed in the first couple phases, the enclosures were quite large, all encompassing, and we've tried to do it on this at Grand Cours in smaller enclosures, and we're going to see how they work. But we do build them. We do have to protect the vegetation, at least originally. We found in this work, you get what you want faster than you expect. We want wildlife to come back in here, but the wildlife comes in just a little sooner sometimes and is ideal for plant growth. So this is just last winter, right? Looking downriver from Grand Cours Ranch towards Garrison on a nice winter day. You can see the banks here. This is a brush matrix bank. So this is brush that we put in for this particular bank design. Right behind it, you can see some transplant woodies in there. And then about midway down the picture, you can see another one of these enclosures. Go ahead, Brian. This slide shows a couple of different things here. So right in the foreground, forefront of the picture, that riverbank there, last spring, it was brand new, and it pretty much 185 feet of it vanished one night. Once again, illustrating the how fragile these are with high water when they first get constructed. It wasn't anything catastrophic, but it did remove it, and we had to rebuild it, and we did. Across the river, there's a couple things here you can see. Probably make out this bank is what we call a double vegetated lift bank. It's got 2 soil lifts encased in Courier fabric, which is a woven biodegradable. It's made out of coconut. It lasts about 5 or 6 years. And you can see on that, there's a couple places where the bank, dips down close to the water. We didn't build it that way. High water event did do some damage to it, but we didn't consider catastrophic, and we consider it more of a natural event. So those things do happen, but when we can and when they're not critical, we just leave them and move on. So that's Grant Coors Ranch. Like I said, just about done. We'll get it planted here this fall, but I think we're pretty much done with that one. Our next phase and what we're starting is phase 3, and we have open bids for that, and we have awarded the contract, and we will be beginning construction in mid-May. So in phase 3, we're going to do a couple things different, a little bit different. Some of the banks are going to be a little bit different. We're going to try some new banks that have 2 lifts, but some topsoil on the start. And then we're going to use probably about 25% will be the style of banks we've been used at Grant Coors Ranch. And then we're also going to use a lot more brush matrix bank than we've used before. That seems, I think it gives a better habitat for some fish. So those are the things we're doing different. It's fairly large volumes, twice what it was, near twice what it was at Grant Coors, but we're looking to start that right away. Next slide, Brian. So to finish here, the next last thing I want to talk about is what next. There's a lot of things, a lot of phases that have some test pitting done. Phase 7, for instance, has a preliminary design done. The Natural Resource Damage Program did some other reconnaissance test pitting this last summer. We have that data. And so we're going to start discussing. The state has to come up with the next phase. Certainly from an operational standpoint, that has to be decided within a year. I don't believe it'll take that long to do it, but there'll be a lot of input from a lot of interested folks on where next. And right now there is no where next. It has not been decided yet. So that's important. I think Bo will hit on a little bit more on some of these stream banks and some of the reconnaissance work that NRD here did last summer.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Joel. Really appreciate that. We have a couple clarification questions from the Q&A that I'd like to ask you to address now, and then we'll move on to the next speaker. First question was, when you were talking about the Grant Coors work, you mentioned this contaminated soils, and the question in the chat, or sorry, from the Q&A from Joel Thompson was, where were the contaminated soils taken?
They were taken to the former Opportunity Ponds in Opportunity, and that is a former tailings impoundment owned by Atlantic Richfield, has 5 square miles, about 140 million cubic yards there of material from the former Anaconda Copper Company smelter, plus about 6 million cubic yards from streamside tailings, a couple million from Milltown. So that is where it's going.
Excellent, thanks. And then one other question, and this one might be a little more challenging, but I'm curious if there's a quick answer. What would be the time frame of natural remediation? Is it is an order of magnitude? Is it 500 years? Is it 1,000,000 years? Kind of curious.
Well, that's almost speculative. It's been 100 years, and it's pretty impacted still. There's some green grass, but that place is pretty poisoned. So I would say natural attenuation of that stuff and those metals to fully oxidize and I think you're talking 100,000 years here.
Great. Well, thanks, Joel. I failed to mention that question was by Mike de Grand Prix. Thank you so much, Mike, for the question. There's some other questions that have come in, but I'm going to save those for the Q&A afterwards. And at this point, thanks again, Joel, and we'll follow up with you after the other speakers. But I'd like to move on to Bo Downing. Bo's an environmental scientist with the Natural Resources Damage Program. Take it away, Bo.
Thanks, Brian. Just going to start by highlighting NRDP's mission. I'll shorten our program's name to NRDP throughout. But basically, it's to recover damages to natural resources that have been injured. An injury or has been injured by the release of hazardous substances to restore, rehabilitate, replace, or acquire the equivalent of the injured natural resources. And I'll dive more into this, but injury is a quantifiable and measurable impact to a natural resource, which in the instance of the Upper Clark Fork is water, sediment, air. A lot of things were injured, and a lot of those natural resources were. And to kind of give an analogy of what restore, rehabilitate, replace, or acquire is, say you were walking in a field and you saw a really cool barn on a farm somewhere, and you opened up the doors and there sat a 1970 Dodge Challenger that had been neglected for the last 50 years or so, and over time it had shown its wear and its tear. And you're looking at this thing and you've got some options. You can break it down to its bare bones and build it back up, which would be sort of like restoration. If it's not that far gone, you could potentially rehabilitate it to a point to where it's functional and looks better. But if it's too far gone and can't be saved, then you replace it or you acquire something that's the equivalent of it. So, NRDP really takes and tries to restore our injured natural resources closest to the place where they are. That doesn't always work, so you've got to move on to doing something in other places that maybe is not as bad. And when that fails, you go out and you look for equivalents in other places that will hopefully help you get those natural resources back to the place where they were injured. So we can go to the next slide. Just to kind of hit home the different roles of DEQ and NRDP, especially as they relate to the Clark Fork River. Remediation, that's there to protect public health and welfare in the environment through implementing the cleanup. As Joel said, the goal is to get it back to baseline. But ultimately their goal is to get the contaminants out of there and to clean up the environment so that over time that it can get back to what it would have been had it not been impacted by hazardous waste. Restoration, we're trying to get to that baseline condition faster. So we can take what remediation is doing on the main stem of the Clark Fork River and go above and beyond what they would do with their available resources and their legal mandates, and try and kickstart those natural processes so that ultimately we're getting to a baseline condition that in a shorter time frame. And that's for the aquatic resources and the terrestrial resources, which includes the riparian area. I think it's important to point out that restoration, whether it's any of these types of ways that we try and make up for those injuries to natural resources, is not an instant gratification type of situation. There's still time to recovery. There's still time for restoration to become effective. But it's our goal to be cost effective and to minimize that time that it takes to get to that point. Next slide, please. Yep, so Joel said, like Joel said, this could be any phase on the Clark Fork River in Reach A. But when DEQ goes out there, their job is to eliminate, reduce, or control the risk to human health and the environment. And the best way to do that is to get this stuff out of the floodplain and tucked away safely. And in these instances, that's opportunity ponds. But if you go to the next slide. As it relates to the Clark Fork River Opera Unit, our restoration goals are to take what you see on the left-hand side there, that's a slicken with copper salts. Our goals are to restore or rehabilitate that place to what you see on the bottom right as quickly as possible. And given the constraints that remediation faces and their obligations, They might not be able to get it to what's on the bottom right-hand corner as quickly without some help from our program, the Natural Resource Damage Program. So in places like phase 3, where we're heading next, it's very likely that DEQ will remove all the stuff that's causing what you see in the left-hand photo, and NRDP will help to make sure that it gets to something that resembles that lower right-hand photo in decades and not longer. So when we talk about restoring, replacing, or acquiring the equivalent of, it's not only those natural resources, water, sediment, air, and other things. We also look to restore lost services. So the fishery was depressed in the Clark Fork River and is still depressed. And so our one of our main goals is to how do we restore the fishery to a point that there's recreational opportunities that are associated with it. So we don't just do the natural restoration or the natural resources restoration. We're also looking for ways to replace or restore or rehabilitate the services that were lost as a result of the hazardous substances as well. So the Natural Resource Damage Program, we operate under a slightly different, structure than remediation. They're tied to various decision documents and things that dictate how remediation is to be achieved. Conversely, NRDP has restoration plans, and we have 2 specific restoration plans that apply to not only the main stem of the Upper Clark Fork River, which is this restoration plan, the one for river, aquatic, and riparian resources, with goals that basically try to get the main stem of the Clark Fork back to its baseline condition. And I want to be careful when I say baseline condition, because we're not talking about what the Clark Fork River would have looked like pre-human, times, or pre-settling, pre-settlement, or any of those things. We're looking to get it back to a baseline that would be there had it not been injured by those hazardous resources, by those hazardous substances. So it's not going to be some, Garden of Eden where there's no impacts whatsoever. We're getting it to a baseline condition that is closely resembles what it would have been had it had not been injured in the first place. And so all of these goals that you can see here are to try and get us to that condition. And as I mentioned, we can go to the next slide. There's another restoration plan at work in the upper basin that looks to restore that main stem trout fishery that's been injured and replace some lost angling opportunities. But a lot of that work is occurring in tributaries or in places adjacent to the Clark Fork River. And that's because as we move to clean up, remediate, and restore the main stem of the Clark Fork, to speed that process up, we wanted to address some of the things that were limiting fisheries recruitment from tributaries. So if you go to the next slide, there are a lot more than just the contaminants in the Upper Clark Fork River Basin that impact our ability to get back to that baseline condition. So obviously metals are a big deal. If you make toxic sediments, you make toxic bugs, you dose fish, the response is going to be negative. But there are all these other things that are listed here that I'm not going to read off that are also limiting factors for restoring those lost resources or those injured resources in the basin. So if you look at the next slide, it's okay to go ahead and advance, Brian. There's lots of project types that we undertake to achieve those goals. We augment flow, and we try and improve stream function through various techniques on the main stem and also in tributaries. We look to improve fish passage and reduce entrainment in ditches. And we also try and improve riparian habitat and protect those investments. and so both plans, both restoration plans that we operate under have lots of different mechanisms that we can use to try and achieve the goals of the natural resource damage program, which is to restore, replace, rehabilitate, or acquire the equivalent of those that we had lost previously. We can go to the next slide. So some examples of integrated restoration actions that have been taken in the past on the main stem of the Clark Fork River. NRDP has funded additional tailings removal that fall outside of areas addressed by Remedy or don't meet the criteria that Remedy operates under. Conservation easements covering places along the main stem of the Clark Fork River where Remedy is going to occur or has occurred. And then we've also reconstructed a couple of tributary channels and their confluences with the Clark Fork River. And we're also very aware, both agencies, of what it costs to implement remediation and restoration and kick off and speed up recovery of the main stem of the Clark Fork River. So we're always exploring ways to share those costs and to make our dollar go further so that we can achieve our mutually beneficial goals. Next slide. This is an example of integrated restoration of remediation in the past. This is in phase 5 and 6 on the Clark Fork, on a ranch that was owned by the Clark Fork Coalition for quite a while. And you can see here that remediation, they came in, they removed the contamination, and they backfilled the floodplain with that clean material so that you can start kicking off the recovery of riparian plants in that riparian zone on that big meander tab there. But if you look inside that green dotted area, this is Modesty Creek, which through historic agricultural practices had been completely shut off from the Clark Fork River and never made it to there. Fluvially, the water never made it to the Clark Fork River. It went down ditches and went to fields, basically terminated in places where it provided no actual fisheries or aquatic habitat benefit to the main stem of the Clark Fork River. So NRDP stepped in and paid for the realignment of Modesty Creek and oversaw the design and implementation of that portion of the work, and then some additional floodplain features adjacent to it to try and kickstart that recovery. So that's just an example of where we've done that in the past. Another thing that we, you can go to the next slide. And now we're going to talk about some of the phase 3 remedy and restoration integration. Joel said that we're looking at several things in phase 3 to improve the situation. One of those things that NRDP is funding and is going to be integrated with the contract with DEQ is some changes to the Helen Johnson ditch. It replaces an irrigation ditch with a pipeline in order to recognize some flow savings in the main stem of the river. It maintains the water users' rights to stock water and irrigation, and it helps us keep fish in the river and not moving down ditches by the way it was designed. So that was something that NRDP was working on parallel to the design process that DEQ was undertaking for remediation. And ultimately, we worked together to get that in as an alternate on their bid package. And we'll be moving to do that in the near future. Go to the next slide. Another thing that NRDP is integrating with DEQ on phase 3 is the additional removal of certain areas of contaminants that make sense from a restoration standpoint. They don't necessarily meet the criteria that DEQ operates under, but working together, we determined that removing these sediments was beneficial not only to the remedy side of things, but to the restoration side of things. So tens of thousands of additional cubic yards of contaminants will be moved removed from phase 3 and ultimately backfilled, remediated, and restored to try and get back to that baseline condition more quickly. Go to the next slide. Another thing, Joel mentioned it, and it's something that he and I and a bunch of other folks worked on over the last several months. And that's where we had opportunities to move away from sort of homogeneous, non-structurally complex stream banks to something that's going to provide near-term stability and near-term habitat opportunities while everything else is growing and ultimately providing the natural functioning system that would create and generate that. So these aren't from the Clark Fork, obviously, these photos at the bottom, but that's similar to sort of the complexity and the results after 1 or 2, 3 years of these more complex bank structures being in place. Ideally, that's what they start to look like. So that's an opportunity that Joel and I and our engineers, we work through. Where do we have opportunities to move away from banks that don't provide this structural complexity, and where can we put these back in or add these in so that we get some more immediate, habitat while everything else is moving into a better condition. And then also we're looking at putting in additional plantings. DEQ's got a EPA approved revegetation plan for the remediation work. And NRDP is working with DEQ and our consultant to see where we have opportunities to supplement those plants and take on that additional cost that's associated with it, so that we get that riparian recovery moving along faster than it would have otherwise. We can go to the.
Hey, Bo, I'll just let you know you're at your 15 minutes, so if you could wrap up, that'd be awesome.
Yep. So another thing we're looking into is the avulsion design. There was an air photo at the very beginning of Brian's presentation, aerial view of water flowing across the meander tab. We're looking at what it takes to align the channel more appropriately, or not necessarily appropriately, but in a stable configuration that's going to provide habitat. And then if you just go to the last slide, next to last slide. Looking ahead and for our next steps, NRDP worked with DEQ, Clark Fork Coalition, FWP, and a bunch of other folks to start thinking about data gaps that are out there that would help us make decisions moving forward. And so we've done some additional soil sampling, basically from Warm Springs Ponds to Garrison. We've done some hydraulic modeling. FWP and the Clark Fork Coalition have done slicking assessments. We're taking on some new erosion rate analysis to help identify areas of risk. And the culmination of that will hopefully be a strategic plan for how we move forward and prioritize phases in the future.
And that's it. Thanks so much, Bo. Really appreciate it. That was a great presentation. I even have struggled over the years to understand the various roles of DEQ and NRDP and how you work together. And so I thought you did a really clear job of laying that out for us. So thanks very much. There's no actually clarifying questions for your presentation. So we'll move on to Nathan Cook's presentation and from FWP. And I'm going to actually stop sharing for just a moment and allow Nathan to share if this works. And the reason that we're changing the ball game a little bit is because Nathan's presentation has a significant amount of animation for your viewing enjoyment this evening. I've also noticed before we get started that there's been more people that have joined us. So I wanted to reiterate a couple things. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see a series of options, and one of those options is Q&A. If you click the Q&A button, you can ask questions of the panelists live, and we're going to use this after Nathan's presentation to talk amongst the 3 panelists, or 4 actually, about some of the major questions that you have. So you can type a question in there, and if it's a clarifying question for the panelists, I'll ask it right after they're done speaking. If not, we'll hold it till the end. So don't forget about that. And I'll also just mention that there are 80 people on the call. This is great. I'm really pleased to see so many people joining us for this update tonight. So thanks, Bo. That was great. And I'll turn it over to Nathan.
Thanks, Brian. Can everybody hear me and see my slides here? Great.
Looking good.
I'm Nathan Cook. I'm a fisheries biologist with Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, and I work in the Upper Clark Fork River Basin. And today I'm going to talk about FWP, who we are and what we do specifically in the Upper Clark Fork River. I'm going to be talking about our fish monitoring efforts in the basin, and those efforts go back over 50 years now. And then I want to talk about sort of what that monitoring tells us about the current status of the trout fishery. So everybody's putting their mission statements up there too, so I'm going to do that too. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but I think that it does a good job summarizing sort of what we do as an agency throughout the state and specifically in the Upper Clark Fork, particularly stewarding the fish, wildlife, and recreational resources of Montana for present and future generations. I thought that was that's really appropriate to what's going on in the Upper Clark Fork. And just a quick bit of history about the trout population in the Upper Clark Fork River. Before about the 1950s, the river was essentially fishless, and that is trout were rare or very hard to find in the upper part of the river. And that's because of the mining contamination that was coming from upstream in Anaconda and Butte. And with the building of the Warm Springs settling ponds and then improvements that took place to those ponds in the 1950s, they treated the water and the pollution coming from upstream sufficiently that water quality increased. And this allowed for a trout population to become established. And it was about this time that FWP started doing electric fishing surveys in the river just downstream of Warm Springs. In 1967, workers at the Warm Springs ponds went on strike, and this caused a halt to the pollution control activities there. And based on FWP surveys during that time period, the river was again considered to be barren of fish. But pollution control measures were soon improved, both in Warm Springs and in Butte. And the brown trout population started to respond to the point where it started booming and increasing during the 1970s. And this is a newspaper article from that era. It's a 1978 Missoulian article with the headline, "Collecting Nuggets in Anaconda's New Gold Mine." And the nuggets they're referring to there are brown trout. And the gold mine is the Upper Clark Fork River, just downstream of Warm Springs. Now, while trout numbers were pretty good in that most upstream section just downstream of Warm Springs, in the rest of the river, they remained fairly depressed. And sampling data indicated that trout numbers are about 1/5 of other nearby rivers that are less impacted by mine contamination. And it's these reduced densities of trout that are something that we're trying to address through remediation and restoration. So once restoration efforts got underway, FWP worked closely with NRDP to develop these sort of fish-specific goals for the restoration. And these are the same 3 goals that Bo mentioned, but I think they're worth mentioning again. Those goals were to restore the main stem trout fishery and replace lost trout angling opportunity. So replace angling opportunity that was lost in the main stem due to mining contamination with angling opportunities in places like the tributaries. And then to maintain and improve our native fish populations. And we continue to work with our partners and stakeholders to develop restoration projects and strategies to achieve these goals. And we're doing a lot of monitoring to help guide restoration efforts and monitor progress in achieving our restoration goals. We've done a lot of different kinds of fish studies in the past. A lot of these studies were funded by both NRDP and DEQ. And they funded things like graduate research projects, natal origin studies, cage fish studies, tagging and movement studies, and then our core population monitoring that we do through electrofishing. And it's that main stem electrofishing that's kind of our bread and butter of data collection on the trout population. And it's what I'm going to kind of focus on for the rest of my presentation here. So when we're out electrofishing in the river, we're trying to get estimates of trout abundance. We're trying to figure out how many fish are out there per unit length of the river. And to do that, we use a mark recapture technique where we go down and make 2 passes down the river, give the trout a little fin clip. And then we come back a week later, and based on the ratio of fish that have our unique mark to the numbers of fish that aren't marked, we can generate our population estimates. And when we're doing this, we're really only targeting catchable fish. So that's fish greater than 7 inches. But in reality, we're only good at catching fish bigger than 10 inches. That's fish age 3 and older. It's due to just biases of our sampling gear and the method we use. And we do this sampling at 7 sections every spring around this time of year. And those 7 sections are indicated here on the map and with the yellow stars. And I've also indicated the boundaries of those reaches A, B, and C that Brian mentioned earlier on. Again, those were, reach A is from Warm Springs to Little Blackfoot, reach B is Little Blackfoot to around Flint Creek, and then reach C is Flint Creek down to Rock Creek and beyond. We also do what we call all river trout estimates, where we sample the entire river from Warm Springs down to Rock Creek. We generate population estimates for the entire part of the river. We've been doing that about every 5 or 6 years. And then more recently, due to recent population declines, as well as public interest and public input, we've started doing more targeted sampling where we do sections in recently or soon to be remediated areas. So this is what some of our population data look like. So this slide is showing trout density estimates on the y-axis. That's the up and down axis that goes from 0 to 1,000 there. That's expressed as fish per mile. Across our 7 annual sampling sections located from downstream to upstream as you're looking left to right on your screen. So those dots are the average population estimate at those 7 sections over a 13-year period. And then those bars are error bars. Essentially, how variable are those are our population estimates at each of those sections from year to year. And what we see is in reach C and lower reach B tend to have our lowest population densities. And we see sort of moderate trout numbers in the middle reaches of the river, and then potentially high trout numbers in our most upstream section, just downstream of Warm Springs. That section also tends to be the most variable. It goes up and down the most compared to the rest of the river. Well, recently, in our recent sampling, trout numbers have been below average, particularly in our sections in Reach A, and most dramatically in our most upstream section. And that's that part of the river where the brown trout population was booming during the 1970s and into the 80s. And it's one that we actually have a long-term record of trout abundance going back to the 70s. So this slide is showing brown trout estimates at that most upstream section, what we call the pH section, going back to 1973. And the general trend has been we saw numbers peak in the mid-1980s at over 2,600 fish per mile. But by 2009, those numbers had declined to 185 fish per mile. Then they kind of recovered quickly following a good few flow years. And in 2013, there were over 1,800 fish per mile. But since 2018, our population estimates have been under 200 fish per mile and reached an all-time low in 2019 at 82 fish per mile. So in the past, good flow years have been essential to produce high trout numbers in this part of the river. And in order to have high trout abundance, you need to have a large input of young fish. This input of young fish is what biologists call recruitment. And recruitment's just a word that comes from the commercial fishing world, and it just means the number of fish growing and surviving to become large enough to be captured, to enter the fishery. And like I said before, in our electrofishing, fish need to be at least 3 years old for us to capture them. So those H3 fish are our index of recruitment. And it would make sense that conditions 3 years ago might influence those current recruitment numbers. And past analyses have suggested that flows are an important predictor of recruitment, and in particular minimum flows, but not minimum flows the year that we're out there sampling, but three years prior, when those fish were fry and perhaps most vulnerable to those minimum flow conditions. And so based on these data, we had a pretty good model for about 13 years where minimum flows were a pretty good predictor of how many fish, H3 fish, we captured 3 years later. But starting in 2018, the model started to fall apart, and flows are no longer seem to be a major driver of trout recruitment in this part of the Clark Fork River. And this is just one example of us using our monitoring data to be able to relate trout numbers to a single environmental variable. But of course, there are many limiting factors in the upper Clark Fork River, and we continue to work with our partners to study those limiting factors and the impact on the fishery. So some of the things we're currently working on, we've added to our annual sampling sections areas that are being remediated or soon will be remediated to better understand the sort of local effects of those cleanup activities and the removal of that vegetation and the banks and things like that. So we added sections at Grant Corps phases 5 and 6 and phase 3-4. And that phase 3 is an area where we've seen very low fish numbers in the past few years. Our estimate there was 41 fish per mile in 2020 and 31 fish per mile in 2019. So with cleanup starting there, in May, like Joel said, really interested to see how the trout population is going to respond there. And just to show some of the data from these targeted sections, as well as all of our sections in Reach A. So here I'm showing estimates from both remediated and non-remediated sections. Again, we're looking at brown trout per mile. And so the blue bars are all the years of data that we have estimates of these sections. And the red bars are just our 2020 estimates. And basically what we're seeing is that brown trout numbers are down throughout the entire river in both remediated and unremediated sections. So this is showing a fairly widespread decline in trout abundance all throughout Reach A and even down into Reach B and C. And we're currently in process of doing our 2021 springtime estimates, and I'm really interested to see if we're going to see some kind of recovery in the upper part of the river. Another thing we're working on past few years with the Clark Fork Coalition was a habitat study where we quantified fish habitat and fish habitat use in both remediated and unremediated areas. And as part of that study, we're looking at how fish habitat evolves and recovers after remediation. Well, while FWP has gathered a lot of data on the trout population in the upper Clark Fork, we're really kind of lacking information on non-trout species. So we're excited to be collaborating with the University of Montana and a PhD student named Taylor Gold-Quiros, who's pictured there. And Taylor will be studying the effects of environmental stressors on the entire fish community. So non-trout species as well as trout species. That's all I've got for you guys. Here's my contact information. If you want access to FWP's sampling data or our reports, those are available on our FishMT website, and I've included that link there. And thank you for your time.
All right. Thanks, Nathan. Really appreciate that. I have a couple clarification questions for you in the chat that we'll ask now. On one of your graphs, it says that 2014 is a major drop off on your graph. When did DEQ start phase one? Were those correlated in any way?
I think DEQ finished phase one in 2014. I'm not exactly sure when it
I
started.
think that's right, Nathan.
Yeah.
Another question for you. Thanks, Nathan. Another question for you is specifically to you. It addresses you, Nathan. Do you think that the reduction of undercut banks in the upper river have negatively affected brown trout numbers?
I mean, I think the removal of undercut banks and other cover habitat, it has to affect brown trout on some level. I mean, we know that brown trout use that kind of holding cover. Whether that means fish just move out of those reaches or those fish just die and disappear, that's the question to me. And that's why we sort of set up this sampling scheme to try to tease that apart.
Great. Thanks, Nathan. I really appreciate that. Thanks to all the presenters. I just want to say one more time, I really appreciate your time this evening. We've got about 20 minutes left for some question and answer and some discussion around these topics. And before we start that, I just want to say that the goals for tonight, which I think we've gotten really close to accomplishing, are for us to meet your public agencies working on Superfund, update you on the process, who's working in the Upper Clark Fork, what's been done, and what are the various roles and responsibilities of the agencies working up there. But there's also a series of next steps. And one of those next steps is to create opportunities for the public to engage with their public agencies in the Superfund process. The Clark Fork Coalition and a community advisory group in the Upper Clark Fork that's been around for quite some time. They're known as CFR-TAC, which is Clark Fork River Technical Advisory Committee. They want to hear directly from impacted communities. They want to ask questions like, what do the river guides, the birders, the landowners, people in the Upper Clark Fork community, members of Deer Lodge Community Anaconda, what do you all think about the cleanup, and how do you want to participate moving forward in new projects and new phases? Specifically, there are a host of landowners that are signed up here tonight that are with us that will be undergoing cleanup over the next 15 plus years, and it's important for your public agencies to hear from you. To facilitate this, the Clark Fork Coalition has agreed to host a facilitated dialogue, a public, hopefully in person, this summer, outside, social distanced, and hopefully in coordination with an Upper Clark Fork tour of some sort, on the ground, on the landscape, to engage in this process of public input. This will be a venue for people to be heard. So each of you after this webinar, maybe not tonight, but sometime in the near future, will receive an email and inviting you to this opportunity and providing you with more information. And we'll put up Alex Leone's contact in the chat. And you can put your email address in there, and folks, you can email him directly if you have questions about that. So I just wanted to throw that up there before we get into the question and answer. But our first question I'd like to pose to the panelists is by Sarah Swiddick. I believe hopefully I've said that right. Sorry, Sarah, if I didn't. Short of the urgency to clean up the Milltown area, why is downstream cleanup taking place before upstream work is completed? And any of the panelists can jump on that one first.
Sure, this is, yeah, Brian, Joel, I can take a swing at it. It's mostly how the bureaucracy of Superfund works. There's, you got these settlements, they're negotiated, there's lawsuits, there's a responsible party that in the end has had to write the checks for this, or do a lot, billions of dollars on their own, up and down the basin. So these things were broken up into these operable units, various, discrete entities, and just the way bureaucracy is, they didn't get settled in an orderly fashion, which is upstream, downstream. However, I would say, we started Silverbow Creek in 1999. Very similar questions, absolutely valid then as they are today. And, the state DEQ thought, well, we have the money, we can't wait, we need to get going. And if we'd have waited in 1999, we would still be waiting today. Silverbow Creek is pretty much a Garden of Eden compared. It was an absolute dead zone when we started down there. There's always the risk when you're not doing the upstream that the upstream contaminates the downstream. That risk certainly still exists, though it's lessened over time. But answer the question is mainly, honestly, it's the bureaucracy of settlements.
Thanks, Joel. Appreciate that. There's another question by an anonymous attendee that Bo answered in the chat, but I'm gonna throw that out there to see if anybody else wants to add to it. We saw several slides of the exposed contaminants near Grant Coors, which Mr. Chavez added are artificially high in concentration during certain periods of remediation. When these concentrated exposed contaminants enter the river after a historical rain event, such as the one we had in late August 2019, are agencies worried about fish kills? Bo said yes, and they took action in 2020 to install erosion control, best management practices, and phase 3 to mitigate the risk. And we are collectively working to evaluate near-term and mid-term strategies to reduce further risk. Does anybody else want to add anything to that?
Bo also mentioned it, but he mentioned we're working on slicken assessments. So we're looking at sort of the risk of other areas of the river to those kind of fish kill events and seeing if other slickens need to be addressed as well. So.
Excellent. Thanks, Nathan.
Yeah, Brian, this is Joel Chavez. I might just add that, yeah, NRD certainly did go out and do that, and they are continuing to do that. And that's really a good deal because those are financial resources a remedy simply doesn't have. So it makes a big difference. We're certainly aware of it, and we're happy they're able to do that in the short term because we just haven't got the resources to run up and down the stream and do that. We just simply have to put our money in a project at a time. So we're happy that they're doing that for us or for the project, for the state, really.
Great. Thanks, Joel. Here's a question. It says specifically a question for Nathan. Is there any temperature data for the water coming, I think you should say, from the Warm Springs Pond? And does that water temperature seem to be affecting the fishery?
That's a really great question. Yes, there is temperature data, both at the outlet of the Warm Springs Pond and Silverbow Creek coming in. And in general, those ponds do warm up the water in the summertime. And particularly, it just doesn't cool off at night. It just stays warm all day. So I think that's a little more stressful to trout. And when we had cage fish studies, we had a fish cage just at the outlet of those ponds, and sure enough, as soon as the water got hot, those fish started to die. Fortunately, the good news is that Warm Springs Creek comes in fairly soon downstream of the ponds, and Warm Springs Creek is fairly cold even in the middle of summer. So that provides a lot of temperature relief for that part of the river.
Thanks, Nathan. Appreciate that. I'm going to jump around a little bit with the questions. Here's a question. Is there any attempt to add some roughness to the stream to provide some aeration and increase oxygen levels? Probably a question for Joel or Bo.
Yeah, not as part of the remedy, there's not. The remedy absolutely does not address the stream channel. Right, wrong, or indifferent, that's not included in the remedy.
Bo, do you want to add anything about restoration on that one? Or are you good?
Yeah, I'm just going to say that, the way this is all worked out is we don't tend to touch anything in channel. And from as a geomorphologist, there are some sediment starved situations because of Warm Springs ponds and things, but generally we're looking at a normal armored freestone stream bed, and we don't typically touch it.
Cool. Thanks, Bo. One question that's follow up on the ponds discussion is, If the ponds are still dumping into the Clark Fork, aren't we feeding the river more contaminants? And is that a challenge or an issue moving forward?
Yeah, well, Daryl Reed from DEQ is our guy on it, but actually I did talk to Daryl in preparation for this meeting. And right now and for some time, the actual water quality coming out of Warm Springs ponds is not that bad at all. There's still some exceedances, but the last couple of years, it's actually not that bad at all. So, but if anybody really wants to, get details, let me know, and I will put you in touch with Daryl Reed. He is the guy.
Excellent, thanks. Appreciate that. One other question that we were just asked was, and I think I'm going to let Nathan speak on this really quick. There was some discussion about temperature data, and there was a question of where we can find some of that temperature data. Nathan, can you just speak to that real quick? And then we could put some information in the chat if we need to.
Yeah, I was trying to type a message there that the temperature data from those cage fish studies are in my annual reports, and prior to 2017 when we stopped doing those studies. So you can get those off that FishMT website or contact me and I can send them to you. As a sort of regionally, we're working on getting all of our FWP temperature data because we collect temperature data all over the place. We're working on getting that into our database. And at some point that stuff would be publicly available. But in the meantime, you can contact me and can find a way to get it to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Nathan. Another question for you real quick. Have you completed fish counts on the major headwater tributaries, Mill Willow Bypass and Warm Springs Creek?
We do estimates and tributaries every year, in different tributaries every year. The Mill Willow Bypass is not one that we've done recently, but Warm Springs Creek is. It's one we're doing every 2 years now. Gosh, I think we have 17 different sections we do in Warm Springs Creek every 2 years. So we have a lot of data on Warm Springs, not so much on the bypass.
Cool, thanks, Nathan. You're a popular guy, as FWP generally is, with the visibility of the charismatic megafauna, the trout. I'll ask you one more. There's somebody in Michael Cast wants to know why FWP stopped doing fish cage studies in 2017.
Well, part of it was we intended to look at the level of metal accumulation in live and dead fish and try to figure out what level of metals was killing these fish. And it turned out that our study design was a little screwed up because we figured out that dead fish actually absorb more metals after they're dead, just like a little sponge. So all of our dead fish were higher in metals than our live fish. So part of it was a study design thing. The other part was of the cage fish study is we were sort of bracketing the remediation phases, the actual construction. So we'd have a set cages upstream of, say, phases 5 and 6 and downstream of phases 5 and 6 to try to determine if the construction itself was stirring up contaminants and that contaminant could potentially be harming fish. And we never saw those effects. So like I said before, when we did see fish die, it was like clockwork during the summer. As soon as water temperatures went up, that's when fish died. So that was our source of mortality, and it was never related to the construction activities itself.
Thanks. A question that might expand us out a little bit to Bo and Joel as well. Mark Mariano says, I've noticed the swales, side channels, and associated wetlands that have been created along Silverbow and Upper Clark Fork during the remediation have become amazing waterfowl and waterbird habitat. These species have noticed, and it seems that, at least anecdotally, this may be a huge success story. Is there any attention being brought to this?
Yeah, we're trying to get it with our current in phase 3. We are going to put some of those in. Now, some of the other phases, there's when private property owners, they do and don't want some things on their property. So that's always a factor. But that phase 3 is private, and the owners there are fine with it, and they're in the design, and we're putting those in because they do work, and the observation is, I've shared that observation is correct.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that one? Okay. Another question from Vicki Watson. Is there water being leased for in-stream flow in the upper river? If so, do you have an estimate of how much?
I'm going to be mad at Brian for not staying on as a panelist because he can't talk, but I don't know of the exact number of in-stream flow arrangements, but the most noticeable in the upper basin, especially in these phases, are the work that Brian and others have done to try and get water from Silver Lake to come down Warm Springs and into the channel. And it's all been experimental and other things at this point. But there are other things that NRDP is doing in tributaries to try and secure additional water. Some water savings at various diversions and things. On lots of tributaries and the flow. Brian Barkowiak takes care of the flow side of things. So hopefully I'm not making them mad by answering this like this right now, but I don't have a quantity off the top of my head right now, but there are a lot of different projects that are in the works or being completed that should help get more water to the main stem of Clarkport.
Alex, did you want to jump in there with CFC's efforts at all?
I could just mention that other partners like the Clark Fork Coalition and Child Unlimited are also helping and assisting NRD with leasing projects and also hold leased water rights in the basin as well. So there's lots of folks working on it.
Excellent, thanks. Another question, if fish numbers plummeted in the Galen area after phase 1 was completed, and it appears from a graph that Nathan presented, would a similar approach to remediation have been applied to the Grand Cours area? Or why would a similar approach be applied to the Grand Cours area?
Once again, we don't know why, as Nathan pointed out, we don't know why the fish numbers are going down. It's certainly not contamination from construction. I think we do know that, but I suspect that it is, we have to remove the banks as part of the remedy. That's the deal. And if they're nice undercut banks that the brown trout like, they go away. They have to be replaced. That is part of the remedy is those banks are contaminated and they need to be removed. So unfortunately, that part of it remains the same because the contaminants, the idea is to remove the contaminants. So it's a short-term loss for long-term gain.
I just want to add to that and point out that as Joel and I have mentioned for phase 3, we've really looked for opportunities to go to stream banks that DEQ and NRDP both really like, add in some of that complexity. Are they as good as a really well-defined undercut bank? Maybe not, but at least it's not some homogeneous, smooth-faced, double vegetated soil lift, and they serve their purpose. And Joel and I had a pretty heavy lift convincing engineers to assume more risk. They're putting stamps on paper as it associates with that. So there's always this balancing act, risk reward, constructability, material availability. There's so many things that go into being able to build a stream bank, and we certainly are working to try and mitigate for some of those near-term impacts. But it's important not to lose sight of the long-term goal, which is not to kill fish with metals. And the way to do that is to get the metals out of the fluvial system so that they can't be introduced to begin with.
Awesome, thanks, Bo, I really appreciate it. So there's a question that I'd like to answer, and I think I'm gonna probably turn this to Alex. There's a question presented, how is this event particularly advertised to local communities? I did not see it on the websites like Anaconda Deer Lodge County, Powell County, or Arrowhead Foundation.
Yeah, and I would say we did reach out to the Arrowhead Foundation, sent emails to Tia, and reached out to the community outreach groups in Butte. And I'm sorry if you didn't, the notice didn't get out far and wide enough, but next time we'll do a better job making sure that the note gets out to everyone. So I also actually have a follow-up question too, just because I received quite a few questions personally before this event. And there has been critiques in the past, we've heard this for years, that perhaps the cleanup's creating a bit of a fish desert, because you are removing a lot of habitat, right? We understand the reasons why, Joel's explained it, but I guess one of the questions that I've heard from the community is, how is the state adapting going forward to address those concerns a little bit? Are there plans to try to augment some habitat or to take a deeper dive into that? Because I do know that that's been voiced pretty frequently.
Well, I mean, what we're really doing, Bo just described what we're doing, is we're trying to put back some things immediately to try to replace that habitat faster. That's the main thing we're doing. Overall, though, I mean, it's just, it costs money to do this. It's a tight resource, and we're just trying to do the best we can with allocating those funds.
Thanks, Joel. Bo or Nathan, anything on that? Okay, great. Well, I'm conscious of everybody's time. We said that this would run from 6 to 7:30, and we're there. We're at 7:30. So I have a couple things. There's one more question I want to address, but first I want to say thank you again so much. Bo, Nathan, Joel, Alex, thanks for taking the time to do this. I think this is really important. We're hoping to share this video on the Clark Fork Coalition website so that other people can view it and hear the update for the Superfund processes right now for the work going on in the Clark Fork, Upper Clark Fork. Well, the question that came in was, outside of what I mentioned earlier, the Clark Fork Coalition and the Clark Fork River Technical Advisory Committee being interested in gathering public comment from landowners, from users of the river, from the interested public that wants to weigh into the agencies on this work and future work. The question that came in were, are there other ways to give public agencies feedback and to participate in the planning of future phases? I was wondering if maybe Bo, Joel could weigh in on that real quick.
Gee, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, there's always a way. I mean, my contact information is there. Give me a call anytime, and I'll meet anybody, meet right down on the river, and we'll just talk about it. That's the best way to do it. And I'm always free for that. So
great, thanks, Joel. Bo, you good? Or you want to?
Oh, if I'm remembering correctly, at one point you said that there would be invites going out to interested parties to expand on this in the field, hopefully vaccinated and socially distanced, or in a way that is safe for everybody. And if that's the case, then I encourage anybody that's got an interest in this to come out, and we can talk about it, and we can talk about what's working, what's not working, and those sorts of things. So.
Perfect. Thanks, Bo. That's a great segue. Like I mentioned earlier, the Clark Fork Coalition will host a facilitated discussion just of the interested public, kind of agency separate, to have a discussion and to hear the feedback about what you heard tonight, what you know about Superfund in the Upper Clark Fork, what you'd like to see, what your concerns are, what your challenges are, and then consolidate some of that information and provide some targeted feedback to public agencies for phases, planning, and restoration and remediation moving forward. So thanks to everybody. Thanks to the Clark Fork Coalition. Thanks, Bo, Nathan, and Joel. This has been a great activity, and really appreciate everybody joining us tonight. Have a great night, and we'll talk to everybody soon.